Welcome to Fact News.
Stephen A. Smith leaned forward in his chair, the weight of the latest news pressing against his usually confident demeanor. The story of Jimmy Kimmel's suspension was everywhere, dominating the headlines and sparking conversations in studios, newsrooms, and living rooms across America. For Smith, it wasn't just another story about a late-night host caught in controversy. It was a test case, a moment that revealed the fragile line between free expression and corporate caution in modern media. He began by saying what he truly felt. He was not happy, not satisfied, and in fact, he was disturbed. The decision to suspend Kimmel, in his eyes, was troubling not simply because of what was said in that single monologue but because of what it represented about the direction the industry was taking. Smith chose his words carefully, but his passion was evident. He reminded his audience that Jimmy Kimmel had given decades of his life to ABC and Disney. For over 20 years, he had been a fixture of late-night television, making audiences laugh, making them think, and at times pushing conversations into uncomfortable but necessary territory. Smith was clear that this wasn't about defending every joke or every statement Kimmel had ever made. Instead, it was about defending the man's character, his loyalty, and his intent. He described Kimmel as a good man, someone with his heart in the right place. That phrase was more than a casual compliment. It was a shield, an acknowledgement that while mistakes might be made in live broadcasting, the person behind the microphone still mattered. As he spoke, Smith's voice carried the weariness of someone who has lived long enough in front of cameras to know how unforgiving the spotlight can be. He has faced backlash himself over comments, analysis, and passionate debates. He knows that once the public seizes on a phrase or a misstep, it spreads faster than any defense or clarification ever could. So when he called Kimmel's suspension disturbing, it came not only from sympathy but from recognition of the dangers that come when corporations move quickly to silence rather than to contextualize. Still, Smith did not pretend that Kimmel's words had been harmless. He admitted openly that what Kimmel said in his controversial monologue was not the wisest move in the world. By intertwining humor with a tragedy and weaving in political references, Kimmel had stumbled into territory that was almost guaranteed to ignite outrage. Smith's point, though, was that intent matters. Kimmel was not malicious, not someone taking cheap shots for shock value. He was a comedian doing what comedians have always done, holding a mirror to society, sometimes clumsily, sometimes brilliantly, and sometimes in ways that spark disagreement. But disagreement, Smith stressed, is not the same as disqualification. A poor choice of words should invite conversation, critique, maybe even an apology, not immediate suspension. Smith's reflections took on a deeper resonance as he considered the environment in which all broadcasters now operate. He noted how quickly Nexstar, one of ABC's largest affiliates, had pulled Kimmel's show in response to the uproar. He pointed to the nervousness of advertisers, companies that increasingly see controversy not as an opportunity to engage audiences but as a threat to their bottom line. And then there was the pressure from regulators, political leaders eager to turn every media incident into a talking point. In this storm, ABC executives acted swiftly, suspending Kimmel indefinitely. For Smith, the speed of that decision was a warning sign. It showed how fragile even the most established figures in media had become, how little protection decades of service and proven loyalty offered when controversy struck. The sadness in Smith's tone came from understanding what this meant not only for Kimmel but for everyone in the industry. If someone as seasoned, as respected, and as valuable to a network as Jimmy Kimmel could be benched overnight, then what did that mean for younger voices trying to build their careers? What did it mean for comedians, commentators, or analysts who wanted to take risks, to challenge audiences, to step outside safe boundaries? The message, Smith feared, was clear: play it safe, avoid controversy, don't say anything that might upset sponsors or affiliates. And in that kind of environment, he warned, the very spirit of commentary and creativity could die. As he continued, Smith's passion grew more visible. His hands moved as he spoke, slicing the air to underline his points. His voice rose, not in anger but in urgency, as if trying to shake his audience awake to the larger implications. He made it clear that his concern was not just for one man's career but for the integrity of media itself. He reminded everyone that broadcasting, whether in comedy, sports, or news, thrives on boldness. It thrives on personalities willing to take chances, to say what others might be afraid to say, to create conversations that linger long after the cameras stop rolling. Without that, the industry becomes bland, predictable, and lifeless. Smith finished his reflection with a mixture of empathy and realism. He repeated his belief that Jimmy Kimmel is a good man, someone who deserved more consideration than he was given. He admitted the misstep but refused to let that single moment erase a lifetime of work. And then he pivoted to the future, warning that if networks continued down this path, they risked losing the very voices that kept audiences engaged. The suspension of Jimmy Kimmel was more than a disciplinary action. It was, in Smith's eyes, a signal flare, a warning that the walls around free expression in corporate media were closing in faster than anyone wanted to admit. For Smith, speaking out was not optional. It was necessary. Because to stay silent while a fellow broadcaster was silenced would be to accept the chilling effect creeping across the industry. And that, for Stephen A. Smith, was unacceptable. Stephen A. Smith returned to the topic later that day, this time with more energy, his words carrying the urgency of someone who felt the problem ran deeper than one suspension. The studio lights glowed around him, and multiple monitors displayed the breaking news headline, "Jimmy Kimmel suspended indefinitely." Smith leaned into the camera, his face marked by a mixture of frustration and determination. For him, the issue was no longer just about defending Kimmel's character or pointing out that he had been with ABC for decades. This was about the entire structure of media, about the pressures that shape what can and cannot be said on television, and about the forces that increasingly dictate how networks react to controversy. He began by addressing the chain of events that had led to the suspension. Russia had launched airstrikes on Ukraine. Political tensions were high. Kimmel had used his monologue to comment on the reactions to that tragedy, blending humor with politics. But when the backlash erupted, the real story wasn't Kimmel's words, it was the reaction of the institutions around him. Nexstar, one of the largest affiliate owners in the United States, moved quickly to stop airing Kimmel's show. Advertisers raised concerns almost immediately, signaling that their dollars could vanish if ABC did not act. Regulators added another layer of pressure, with the FCC chairman and political voices chiming in on what had been said. In that kind of storm, Smith explained, the decision-makers at ABC and Disney likely felt they had no choice but to suspend Kimmel. But to Smith, that inevitability was precisely what was most alarming. He spoke about the reality of corporate broadcasting in blunt terms. Free speech, he said, is often misunderstood. The Constitution protects citizens from government censorship, but corporations answer to sponsors, shareholders, and affiliates. That means that when controversy strikes, the question is not whether someone's rights are protected but whether their presence on air threatens the bottom line. It is not about law but about money. And in today's fragile environment, where television ratings are down, ad revenue is shrinking, and streaming platforms are pulling viewers away from traditional channels, networks are more nervous than ever. They react not with patience or perspective but with speed, often sacrificing fairness in the process. Smith's frustration grew as he explained the chilling effect this creates. When people see a veteran like Jimmy Kimmel, a man with decades of service, a loyal audience, and a proven ability to carry late-night television, sidelined overnight, what lesson do they take away? It is not that Kimmel made a mistake and will learn from it. It is that no one is safe, no matter how long you have worked, no matter how loyal you have been, no matter how much money you have made for the network. The lesson is that controversy will not be tolerated, and the safest path forward is silence. For Smith, that was a devastating message. He reminded his audience that television thrives on boldness. From comedians to commentators to analysts, the magic comes from those willing to take risks, to say something that might make people laugh, think, or argue. Remove that willingness, and what remains is bland commentary, designed to offend no one and inspire no one. At one point, Smith gestured passionately, his hand slicing through the air as if to underline the urgency of his point. He drew on his own experiences in sports media. He has often walked a fine line, balancing his unfiltered opinions with the realities of working for a massive corporation like ESPN. He has faced critics, sponsors, and executives, and he knows the pressure that comes when every word can be replayed, dissected, and judged. That personal understanding gave his defense of Kimmel extra weight. He was not speaking as a distant observer but as someone who lived with the same pressures, someone who knew what it meant to speak into a microphone and feel the world watching for a slip. As his commentary continued, Smith widened the scope even further, pointing out the broader cultural implications. The more corporations respond to outrage by silencing voices, the more they hand power to those who weaponize outrage. If a small but vocal group can generate enough noise to scare advertisers, then they effectively control what goes on the air. And if politicians can pressure networks through public criticism or regulatory threats, then the independence of media becomes even weaker. What begins as one suspension quickly becomes a precedent, shaping how all broadcasters behave in the future. Smith warned that the industry was heading down a path where creative people would self-censor so heavily that they would lose their edge entirely. He reminded his audience of what late-night television once was. Hosts like Johnny Carson and David Letterman thrived on unscripted, risky moments. They sometimes pushed too far, sometimes offended people, but they also created the kind of cultural conversations that kept audiences tuning in night after night. That tradition, Smith feared, was slipping away. Instead of embracing bold personalities, networks seemed more focused on protecting themselves from controversy. And the irony, he noted, was that by doing so, they were making themselves less relevant. If audiences can only find safe, predictable content on television, they will turn to online platforms, podcasts, and independent creators for the kind of raw, unfiltered voices that TV no longer allows. By the time Smith wrapped up his thoughts, the passion in his delivery had turned almost into a plea. He was not asking for Kimmel's comments to be ignored or excused. He was asking for context, for patience, for an understanding that broadcasting is a human act, prone to mistakes, but also capable of great impact. To suspend Kimmel so quickly was, in Smith's eyes, to deny him the chance to explain, to clarify, or to grow. It was also to send a message to every broadcaster that their careers hang by a thread, vulnerable to the next wave of outrage. For Smith, the suspension was not just a news item. It was a warning about where the media is heading, a warning he felt compelled to voice. He closed by stressing again that Jimmy Kimmel is a good man, a man whose heart is in the right place. But even good men can make mistakes, and if those mistakes are punished with silence instead of dialogue, then the media industry risks losing its soul. The conversation around Jimmy Kimmel's suspension did not quiet down after Stephen A. Smith's first remarks. If anything, the debate only grew louder, spreading across social media, talk shows, and online forums. By the next evening, Smith found himself once again in front of the camera, compelled to push the discussion further. This time, his tone was not just passionate but almost weary, as if he was carrying the weight of a problem too large for one commentator to solve. Yet he refused to back down, determined to make sure people understood the deeper implications of what was happening. Smith began by acknowledging the sheer chaos surrounding the situation. Kimmel's suspension had sent shockwaves through late-night television, leaving fans stunned and industry insiders scrambling. Rumors swirled about whether other hosts might be next, whether advertisers would begin dictating content more aggressively, and whether the very fabric of late-night comedy was at risk. Smith described the mood as one of unease. People were not only angry but also uncertain about what the future might hold. That uncertainty, he argued, was exactly why this conversation needed to continue. He leaned forward, his voice lowering as he painted a vivid picture of the pressure cooker environment inside media companies. Imagine, he said, being a writer or comedian in today's world. Every joke, every phrase, every idea has to pass through an invisible filter of potential backlash. It is no longer enough to be funny or insightful, one must also predict how thousands of strangers might interpret a line, how a sponsor might react, how a regulator might respond. The result is a climate of hesitation, where creativity is stifled before it even reaches the stage. For Smith, that was one of the greatest tragedies of this entire episode, not just the suspension itself, but the chilling effect it created for everyone else in the business. From there, he shifted to a broader cultural critique. He reminded viewers that comedy, by its very nature, has always been provocative. Great comedians push boundaries, tackle uncomfortable truths, and hold a mirror up to society. They often spark controversy, but that controversy is part of what makes the art form powerful. Take away that edge, Smith argued, and you take away the very essence of comedy. Jimmy Kimmel, like many before him, has built a career on balancing humor with cultural commentary. To punish him so harshly for one controversial moment was, in Smith's view, to misunderstand what comedy is supposed to do. He paused, letting that point settle before turning to the issue of fairness. This, he said, was what frustrated him most. Why is it that some figures in entertainment or politics can say and do things far more inflammatory without consequence, while others are sidelined almost immediately? The inconsistency suggested that decisions were less about principle and more about power. Those with strong corporate or political backing often escape accountability, while others, even veterans like Kimmel, are sacrificed to appease outrage. That imbalance gnawed at Smith, because it revealed a system driven not by values but by fear and influence. As he spoke, his words grew heavier, as though he was wrestling not just with the news itself but with the broader state of society. He pointed out that America has entered an era where outrage has become a currency. Entire platforms thrive on amplifying anger, turning minor controversies into major crises. In such an environment, networks often feel they have no choice but to act swiftly and dramatically, even if that means abandoning fairness. The cycle is predictable. A comment sparks backlash, the backlash goes viral, advertisers panic, and networks overreact. By the time the dust settles, reputations are damaged, trust is eroded, and little is actually resolved. Smith argued that breaking this cycle requires courage from those in power. Networks must be willing to stand by their talent, to weather the storm long enough to assess situations fairly rather than rushing into drastic measures. Audiences, too, must learn to separate genuine harm from mere offense. And critics must recognize that calling for someone's suspension or cancellation carries real consequences, not just for the individual but for the industry as a whole. Without that balance, Smith feared, the media landscape would become increasingly timid, with fewer and fewer voices willing to speak honestly. At one point, Smith shared a personal reflection. He admitted that he himself has faced moments when his words drew criticism, sometimes from powerful corners of society. Each time, he had to decide whether to back down or stand firm. Those experiences taught him that being outspoken comes with risks, but it also comes with responsibility. That, he insisted, was the role Jimmy Kimmel had played for years, a man who took the stage night after night, knowing that his words might stir debate, but also knowing that those debates were worth having. To silence him now was to silence that entire tradition of engagement. As the segment drew to a close, Smith's voice softened. He looked directly into the camera, as if addressing not just his viewers but the industry itself. He urged decision-makers to reconsider the path they were on. Suspension should not be the first response to controversy, he said, dialogue should. Instead of sidelining Kimmel, why not allow him to explain, to engage in a conversation with his audience, to use the moment as a chance for growth? That would not only preserve his voice but also demonstrate that television is still a place where difficult conversations can happen. His final words carried both frustration and hope. Frustration that the industry seemed so quick to bow to pressure, but hope that moments like this could serve as a wake-up call. If networks, advertisers, and audiences could learn to value dialogue over punishment, then perhaps the media could reclaim its role as a true marketplace of ideas. But if not, Smith warned, then the future of television, and of voices like Jimmy Kimmel's, would remain in jeopardy. With that, Smith leaned back, his expression heavy but resolute. He had said his piece, knowing full well that some would agree and others would criticize. But for him, the risk was worth it. Speaking out was, after all, what he had built his career on. And in defending Jimmy Kimmel, he was defending not just a colleague but the very principle that keeps media alive, the freedom to speak, to joke, to provoke, and to be heard.